Azure services. The outline of this module, it's very simple yet an interesting one, where we'll learn like the architectural components in Azure, like what is a region and availability zone, what is a subscription and resource group, and then the core Azure resources like compute, networking, storage, and databases. So whatever I just showed you now in the Azure portal, where if I go here, I showed you something like compute, and then I showed you other options. That's what you're seeing now. There is your compute, networking, storage, and databases. So compute, databases, storage, and networking. These four categories will go through. Now, core architectural components in Azure. So in this, main objective is to understand what is a region, what is a regional pair, what is an availability zone, resource group or resource, and then subscription, which is Azure subscription, or what is an ARM or Azure Resource Manager, and then Azure management groups. Logically, these are something you must know, because only then you can understand very in-depth concepts of Azure. Number one, region. What do you mean by that? Technically, a region is nothing but, suppose if I try to create some resource, let's say like a VM, I'm not creating it, just showing you. The question is that in which country or which data center of Azure you will create it. Now that's where the thing comes, the region where you see Southeast Asia, East US 2, Central US, Australia East, North Europe, US, etc. and etc. and etc. Around 60 data centers that Microsoft has, in which you can select up to 40 data centers which are different countries. So the map you can see, the map shows you the numbers. Like every blue circle in here is nothing but a data center, a physical office of Azure which has CPU core and RAM connected with network inside. See, plenty of these you have in here. So each and every data center, which means right now I'm in India, sitting in India, I can control a server that could be running in Norway. I can control a server that is running in US. I can plan and play with a server that is running in Canada. So you can do anything, anywhere that you wish, and that's what your region is all about. So you have an option to pick any data center across the globe and deploy your workloads, and that's a region. So typically, Brazil South, South Africa, that is South Africa North, or South Africa West, South India, Central India. All these are what regions are. Regions. What is a regional pair? So technically, you should know one particular factor. That's what an Azure or any cloud service provider should follow. So every cloud service provider, they have some consideration. That is, at any cost, a cloud service provider like Azure or AWS, they are not supposed to take your data from one country to another country by themselves for a business continuity and disaster recovery. Which means, suppose I'm using East US as a data center and I create my VM. And because of some reason, the data center of East US was crashed or destroyed, let's say because of some earthquake. Now, in such a scenario, my VM will not work. Now for this, I can implement a business continuity where I can create the same VM in some other country. We are not talking about that for now. But the factor is, a cloud service provider like Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform, they are not allowed to take your VMs or workloads or anything that you deployed in one data center to another data center which is in different country by themselves. So they have something called business continuity and disaster recovery, which has a regional pair. See, Asia Pacific is a geography, and when I create a VM, if I select, let's say, East Asia, if you say East Asia is the one you're picking up. Now, in that case, I say my VM is going to get created in East Asia by selecting it because my customers are in East Asia. So I want to ensure that application will be hosted in East Asia, so it will reduce the latency for my customers. That's what your business process you think about. Now, if Azure is responsible for implementing a DR for your data, in such a case, they cannot copy your data from East Asia and keep the data in some other data center, like let's say Korea Central. They can't do that. So they have regional path. So from East Asia data center, they can take your data only to Southeast Asia or in vice versa. Why? Because as I discussed, from one country to another country, Azure cannot take the data by themselves and keep it for disaster recovery, which is a business compliance issue. So to make it clear, they will have regional pairs. So any data that they copy from one data center to another data center for business continuity, they will maintain within one geographical region like Asia Pacific, which is one geography, Australia, which is one geography, in which this data center is paired with this data center. So that's what a regional parish. So practically, North Central US, if it is paired with South Central US, they would be like more than 300 miles away from each other. That's a physical distance they will have. So if a natural disaster happens to this one, it will not affect this location. At the same time, they will have a optical fiber connection between each other, so data will be shared between each other in a secure way by using optical fiber. So in event of failure, you have a choice that you can find your data in this region. In the event of Microsoft replicates it, whereas we do have choices where we can choose the choices to take my data from this data center and put it in UK South. You can do that. Is when you do the replication, you can do it, but when Azure does, they cannot take it from, let's say, from here to here. It's only between their parts they can take because of compliance. So regional parts, you should know that it's like one data center which is having a neighbor region for it. That's a regional part. Now geographies, just now I said Southeast, or then let's say Asia, India, or Africa. All these are your geographic. So geographic, it typically speaks about, it could have minimum of two regions. A region is nothing but, let's say this one. East Asia is a region, Australia East is a region, Australia Southeast is a region. Whereas geography is this one, Australia is a geography. So minimum, any geography, minimum it will have two different regions. This is because they want to keep a disaster recovery within a region. That's the reason why within any geography they will have minimum two regions, which is nothing but a physical location in which there will be data center. You take Brazil South, South Central US. They are regional pair where it's geographically one single region for them. So this way for everything, even India. So Central India, South India, they are regional pairs. West India, South India, they are regional pairs. Which means anywhere you go, let's say someone said that they are from UAE. So some of the participant mentioned it earlier. So you see in UAE, you have UAE North and a regional pair UAE Central. So minimum two you will have at any cost in a region. So region is this one, a complete location, like United Arab Emirates. In that you can have two different regions. A region is nothing but a physical data center, or it could be even more than two, three, four, six, depending on the country. Now that's a region for you. Now that's something Azure is doing it based on the data resiliency, compliance terms, and everything they give you. That's the geography. On the other part, the availability options, when you speak about it, you should know this. A region which I'm saying that a physical data center, like let's say East Asia, it could have only one data center in here, or it could have three data centers, which are like hundreds of miles away from each other connected through optical fiber connection. That's called zones for you. So why I'm saying that right now, to make you clear, suppose if I select, let's say the region like East US, in East US there can be one data center, or there can be three different data centers which are physically away from each other but logically connected through optical fiber connection. This is a particular factor you can take. That's where you can understand the concept in it. They are called physical data centers. So in a simple word for you, every physical data center is called zone. So a data center is, you can just consider a zone. Every physical data center is a zone. So logically, if you now understand, so in regions, which is like every data center, that is East to West, Southeast Asia, etc., etc., there could be one data center to maximum three data centers in a single region. So this each data center, it's called zone, ZONE, zone. So every single data center is called zone. Whereas region is East to us, West to us, etc., etc., is a region. Now inside East to us, you can have one data center, two or three. Normally in East to us, we have three data centers, which means zone 1, zone 2, zone 3 you can call. So every single data center you can technically call it as zone, because that would give you more clarity when you understand the very advanced level concepts of availability zones and etc. So make it clear. Inside a geography is where a region is, and inside a region is where your data center is, which is nothing but zone. Every data center you can call it as zone. So I'll share you the slides with you. You can refer to that later for understanding. Now regarding availability option, what do you mean by that? The question is, the question is, That is, when you said that your VMs will be created in a physical rack like a picture which I showed earlier. That is an image I showed you, a vertical rack with CPU core, RAM, etc. and etc. This image. So a very simplified question that anybody could have is that kind of picture whichever you have, what is the guarantee that you can give me? Suppose if you really understand, see this rectangular thing you have in here, this one, it's called host, physical host we call it, because this is a physical computer in which your virtual machines get created, which means if I say I want a VM with 2 CPU core and 4 GB RAM, 2 CPU core and 4 GB RAM will be pulled logically from this server and a virtual machine gets created for me. Another customer comes and he say I want 2 GB RAM and 8 CPU cores as a VM. Then he can take the same CPU core and RAM from the physical device that is available and he can logically use it. So if you understand the concept here, the question is, what if this entire physical rack which is connected with one common power supply gets crashed? Maybe a short circuit or this rack got crashed. It's a downtime. When you say downtime, it's nothing but your application is not available to the customer. So for that, you get something called availability, which is a guarantee that within one whole year, how many hours, minutes, or seconds of time I can expect that my server will go down. So these are called SLA, or you can say service level agreement, where if you just create a single virtual machine and you migrate your application from on-premises to Azure with a concept called lift and shift, and you host your application in that VM, just one VM you create and host your application, and it is attached to the premium solid state drive. It is a storage option, a premium hard disk, like hard disk which you attach a premium solid state drive for a very good performance. If it is just a single VM with whatever the, like, let's say I need 10 CPU cores and 40 GB RAM, you gave it and you created it, in that case you get an SLA like 99.9% of SLA. In a simple word, let's see this. So one whole year, what is the total number? 365 days, and every day has 24 hours. Let's multiply it. So 8,760 hours in a year, and in that they're mentioning that 99.99% of time the server will be available, which means 0.10% there is a downtime. So if I multiply this, let's say to understand that 0.10%, that's particularly let's say 0.01, I can say that's what your 0.10 could be. On making this calculation, it can say that 87.6 hours in one whole year, I can have a downtime of 87.6 hours of time. So that's what the meaning is. So I'll explain this later, just giving you a number to make you understand. So when they say 99.9% in one whole year, for a time of 99.9%, your server will function, but 0.0, that is 0.1% of time the server might not work, is what they're mentioning. If in case it's one single server. Suppose you go with a concept called availability zones. What do you mean by that? In East US, as I said, in East US, there are 3 physical data centers, which means zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3. 3 physical data centers. And all 3 data centers, they are connected to each other with an optical fiber connection. Zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and all 3 of them, they are in connection to each other through optical fiber. Now, in case you create a VM, but not a single VM, maybe an application you're hosting, but same application you host in multiple VMs, like VM1, VM2, VM3, 6 VMs you create, where two VMs in each data center. In that case, you get a service level agreement of 99.99%, which means in one whole year, you will have a downtime which could be equivalent to 0.01% of time. But out of 365 days, 99.99% of time, all your servers will be up and running for you. So end customer will not face any downtime. That's what this meaning is. Third one, multi-region disaster recovery, which means my servers are not only in East US data center. Let's consider this. What if the East US data center, all 3 data centers which are physically away from each other, which is zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, which I said in East US, all 3 are crashed. Imagine that there is a failure, or let's say some kind of technical issue. Now, all 3 data centers are not working, which means all VMs and all the 3 data centers are gone down. So incoming user will not get any response in that period of time. So you can implement a concept called disaster recovery, which means from East US, you can replicate your VM to, let's say, South, or let's say West US I can take, or Southeast Asia, or anything I prefer. So in the event of entire East US getting crashed, my VMs will be up and running in this location, which will give me the disaster recovery. So that's how the thing work for you, which is your multi-region disaster recovery concept. That's your availability zones options. So remember this. It is something which you might not have to know now because it's very advanced concept, but consider this when you create VMs as an admin or an architect, you will have to focus on these factors. The availability zones, I think I already explained it, just putting in front of you. So East US, you take an example, or Southeast Asia, etc. and etc. But not all the data centers will have money. I mean, like, let's say South India, you take, there is only one data center in South India. So in South India region, there are no 3 physical data centers. You take Central India, in Central India, there are 3 physical data centers, which means depending on which region you select, you might get availability zones or you might not, which means you might get only one data center or you might get 2 or minimum 3 data centers in such cases. So availability zone at the end of the day, as I said, it's a physical office, a physical data center with a power supply, optical fiber connection between each other, and moreover, each data center is in connection to each other. And one of the best things about them, they will give you a guarantee that a small natural disaster in one location in, let's say, East US will not affect the other data centers because minimum like 100 of miles away there will be, which could guarantee an availability. So until the entire East US is crashing, at least other 2 data centers will work for you, which is a benefit. That's why you get more service level agreement. So in the event of all these getting crashed, that's why you go for the third architecture. Like all your VMs in East US, you replicate them to other data center like Southeast Asia, etc., which is an advantage. Now, regarding the Azure resources that can get benefited from these kind of features, if you see, you have Azure virtual machines, storage accounts, or virtual networks, or app services, databases, or functions, which are all Azure services that could rely on these kind of architectural practices for performance. I'll walk you through all these, your virtual machines, app services, etc., and etc., which I have now. I'll walk you through. Now, before that, you should understand a component called resource groups. What is that? A resource group, the name itself says resource groups. Resource. What is a resource? VM, DB, virtual network, storage, whatever you create, that's a resource. Group is a folder, which means all your resources you group under one folder. That's called resource group. Why you need it and what is exactly required concept in here? When you have, or when you're going to create one or more servers, let's say 100 servers of different projects, you create them, then it becomes very harder for you to distinguish and identify those servers because they could be for different projects. So maintenance, management, billing, and all these becomes hard for you. That's where we use resource groups. That gives you a benefit of logically grouping the resources into one particular folder. So anything you create in the Azure platform, a VM, DB, network, anything, it's mandatory that you should have a resource group. Either you can create a new resource group or select an existing resource group to create the resources, but it is mandatory. So without resource group, deployment of resources are not possible in Azure. And moreover, your resource group is nothing but a folder, a logical folder. Just consider that. Now you can have multiple resources in a single resource group. See like this. A website service, a DB service, a virtual machine, a storage, all these in one single resource group you create, or you create a separate resource group for web and DB service, separate resource group for virtual machine, or a separate resource group for storage service. It doesn't matter, but you need this because it's mandatory in a logical architectural perspective of Azure. Now, ARM or Azure Resource Manager, what is this? So it's a layer, or it's let's say it's an orchestration of Azure. What exactly I can say is, you use your Azure portal, which is a graphical user interface to create resources in Azure, or you use PowerShell commands, the Windows PowerShell commands to create resources in Azure, command line interface, REST API call you make, or any SDK of C#, Java, or Python you use to create services of Azure. At the end of the day, all your code or commands or any request you make from UI, they will be made as a REST API call to a particular term or a particular component of Azure called ARM or Azure Resource Manager. It's the complete heart and brain of the Azure platform. It's a kind of, we can call it as the operating environment where all your authentication for the request you make will take place. Now, once you're authenticated to create a VM, app service, DB, or anything, a REST API call which you made now to this ARM, it will be sent to the REST endpoints, or in other words, the Microsoft service endpoints, or let's say resource provider endpoints, we can call them. For a database, there is a resource provider endpoint called Microsoft dot storage slash database. For web app, Microsoft dot servers dot web app, or you say for virtual machine, Microsoft dot compute slash virtual machine. This way, they have created endpoints to which you can make a call for the purpose of deploying the workloads. For your information, this is something you will understand when I take you to the future topics in the later part. But in a top level, you should understand this, the reality, the practical thing that happens in the background, which is like the physical servers letting you to logically deploy a server where you sit in your home, use your computer, and make the deployments. All these are taken care by this ARM, which is Azure Resource Manager, a place which you are using, or a tool which is managed by Azure that is used as an interface for deploying, managing, and configuring all the services in Azure. So remember that you are using Azure Resource Manager as your deployment environment, the latest and the best one in the market for Azure to deploy resources. Now, before we see the services, you need to understand the main thing, that is a subscription. I said this already, but repeating it again. An Azure subscription is like a SIM card in your mobile phone. So just having a mobile phone, it doesn't mean that you can use internet connection, or you can use the things like your, let's say, mobile phone calls and all these. Same way, just having an account in Azure environment, that is anybody can go to portal.azure.com and sign up with an account. You can use your personal email, office email, anything, and sign up an account. Just having an account, logging in here doesn't mean that you can create services in here. You need an Azure subscription. Same, having a mobile phone doesn't give the services, you need a SIM card, same thing. So having an Azure subscription will now give you the access to Azure services. So any service of Azure you create, the billing for it, like what is the total charge for the services you created in one whole month, those kind of billing Microsoft will track using the subscription. So you can have unlimited number of subscriptions for one single Azure account, like a dev subscription, test subscription, a production subscription, and assign a separate team for each management. And moreover, a subscription that would be managed by using invoicing and everything, where at the end of the day, the process or the hierarchy looks like this. There will be a billing account, that is an email ID, which would be used for tracking the billing and everything. Now in that you create billing profiles using which you can track the billings, where under invoice sections is where your invoices for each subscriptions you can track. So a big organization will have hundreds and thousands of subscriptions. So every service that's being created in the organization, their charges and all these are tracked using a subscription. Now remember, a subscription not only gives you access to resource deployment in Azure, but this is the one that lets anybody to get the benefit of access control and management of Azure services. That's your Azure subscription. And what is this management group? A subscription, I said that a billing unit, whereas management group is something that would help you to organize the subscriptions. What if you need 100 subscriptions in an organization, where 100 subscriptions must be distributed between different branches of your office or different teams in your office? It becomes complex because every team will have their own security and compliance policies and restrictions. That's where this Azure management group becomes useful for you. How it works? So you will have a root level management group by default. So any organization who creates an account in Azure, they will get one root level management group, where for that root group is where there will be children. So you can have a group, a management group, which is a child for this root level management group, and you can nest up to 6 management groups, one below one below one. And inside the management group is where an Azure subscription comes. Now what happens? Totally 10,000 management groups you can create. That's the maximum limit for one single account. Now what happens here? Suppose this is my management group, the root level group, and this is an Azure subscription that I need for, let's say, the development and testing team of my organization. So what I did, I either give all these in one single management group, so development and testing subscription, and then let's say the production subscription. This is fine. This is fine until and unless you don't have many branches in your office. Suppose you have a very big team, different projects working, where each of them require separate permissions. That's where you create separate management groups. Let's say a management group for, let's say, branch one, then have their development and testing subscription in it, and then another management group for branch number two, and then give them a testing and development subscription. But all these will be controlled by one common root level management group, which is your top hierarchy in your organization. So this way, a management group gives you the option of logical management of permissions and compliance policies in your office. Now, these are some factors regarding to your hierarchies and permissions. Now, what we're going to see next is interesting thing, that is core Azure workload products. So we'll now see different things like DB, containers, virtual networks, virtual machines, and etc., which is related to the Azure services, which I'll show you now. Well, before that, if you have any questions, I think there are many in the chat. I'll check them. Just in case you have any other questions until the discussions I made now, you can put it in the chat. You need to select the least latency region to put the workloads in Azure. If not, the performance could be bad. That's correct, Mohammed. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that every time it works the same way. Sometimes what happens, you might not be able to find a service that you need. Suppose I'm using a data center like South India, but in South India, I'm not able to find, uh, let's say a cognitive service API. Then I'll be forced to use some other data center in that case, which could be far away from my customer's location. In such cases, we can use some caching services and etc. to get the job done. But the real use is, yes, always try to pick a data center that is nearby to your customer to ensure that they will have less latency, because latency is an important factor to be considered in any architecture. Azure maintains something called regional pair. Yes, I know that, Mohammed. If you're trying to say that to me, great, thanks for that. I know that you're speaking about the storage account services or any other service that supports for BCDR. Not all the services of Azure will have business continuity and disaster recovery configured by default. So there are services which don't have any BCDR like RAGRS or GRS, which you mentioned. Those are limited with certain services alone. Not each and every service. Let's say you take a VM doesn't come up with a read access geo redundancy. It's just a virtual machine and single data center, but the disk of the VM is the one that comes with the geo redundancy. So there are different considerations we should make, but yes, we have, and it's not applicable for all the services. Certain services will not use RAGRS or GRS. For them, we should use different types of replication mechanism. Lillian, Africa is not included in the zone. Let me check it out. I think you will get it as Brazil rather than getting as Africa. Sorry. So you'll be getting, oh, come on. So I got your point. Like you're saying that Africa was not considered. Rather, you will get it as a Brazil as a region. See, Brazil South and South Central US. So Brazil is the location where your things come. So rather than saying it as Africa, they give you as Brazil. So that's something that Microsoft has as a term. It's only applicable got region or could be for zone as well. I think Atul, you can elaborate. Okay, it's only applicable for region or zone as well. Atul, if you are speaking about business continuity and disaster recovery or whatever it is, please mention that, because I'm not able to understand what you're trying to say. The question,
yeah, Nishant,
can just repeat it.
Is related to disaster recovery. Like we were talking about region, so it can be applied to zones as well.
No, zones are not for DR. Zones are for high availability, which means if one zone goes, still the other zone is available. But if you speak about like I want to do a DR for my VM from zone 1 to zone 2, that's not a best practice and it's not applicable.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome. If the data centers are in US, can their deployment of code be done outside the country? Is it compliant? No, Divya, it's not so. You as a customer, you can take your US data center and replicate the data from US to India. That's not compliant. But when Azure tries to does that, like when Azure tries to take your data from US and put it into Asia for business continuity and disaster recovery, that's a data compliance, because cloud service provider is not supposed to do that. That's why they have regional paths, which means when any concept of DR comes where Azure is responsible for doing it, they will do it within those regional paths. Beyond that, if you want to take the data, you should do it on yourself. Mohammed, nowadays Microsoft promoting landing zones. Can you also talk about it? I don't remember anything like landing zones. Maybe I could check once and get back to you, but probably I don't remember learning or seeing something called landing zones. Maybe if you are speaking about the availability zones, which is typically with multiple data centers between 2 or 3 zones, if that is the case, I'm not sure about it. Maybe once let me check it and I'll get back, because I'm just hearing this for the first time. Okay, 25th February 2020. I believe it's a recent one. Output of multi-subscription accounts for security, scale, and governance. These zones will consider platforms that require to support customers' application portfolio design areas. Okay, I'll just go through this and let me let you. I mean, like I'll go through this and get back to you, because this is not a part of syllabus. And moreover, there's a new thing that launched, like let's say February month, February 20th. It was mentioned. I didn't go through it. Zones consider performance don't reference which infrastructure as best service. Landing zone and hosting your workload, browsing the code, watch for it. Um, okay, this is something which is not regarding to your, let's say, the high availability and DR practice. This is something different. Landing zones is not a part of that. That's the reason it's not touch based, and moreover, I didn't go through that. I found the document, Mohammed. Thanks for that. It's with me. Maybe it's not a part of this discussion as of now. I'll just check it out and get back to you. Maybe in the next session, I'll speak about that. Why we require management groups when user can be differentiated on basis of subscription? Gyan, that's correct. Users can be differentiated on basis of subscription, but when you speak about multiple subscriptions in an organization, you should go to each subscription and differentiate users, which is fine. But if you speak about policies, let's say 100 subscriptions and all 100 subscriptions require same policy to be followed for security and compliance, it becomes complex. That's where management group becomes simplified to overcome the burden of managing such compliance and policies. Any more questions? So Lillian, okay, I think I gave the answer. So any other questions from anybody else? Okay, hoping that we'll proceed now. Okay, Mohammed, I think this link I already have. So landing zone. It's not a part of Azure design. Typically, it's a practice that you make. So what are the picture you gave now? If you see in a high level architecture, if you just see this, it's a concept where you are using your availability zones, the concept of availability sets and availability zones everywhere. And moreover, rather than keeping all your resources in single subscription, you can see different subscriptions you have here. Just out of curiosity, I'm giving you an example on this. So you can see here identity subscription and different other subscriptions they are giving: management subscription, connectivity subscription, landing zone subscription. This way, at the end of the day, same concepts like availability set, availability zone, those are used, but different subscriptions are used in the architecture, which could be a scenario where you are trying to achieve a very complex concept where you need different data centers and different subscriptions to break the barrier of an Azure subscription limit. So that's what this is about. It's typically not that any architecture of Azure that speaks about availability or like availability set or availability zone. So landing zone is a kind of architectural framework you follow. This is not a feature of Azure. It's something you can design in Azure using a subscription. See, multiple subscriptions for different cases, like a management group subscription, a connectivity subscription that uses DNS servers, a landing zone subscription in which you have your servers deployed with application with high availability DR and security. There is sandbox subscription for running applications separately with integration with Git and DevOps and AD as authentication. It's a framework of architecture. So from this, what I can understand is that something which I already did, but not with this name. It's a simplified concept where to break the barrier of a subscription limit, where every subscription will have a limit. Like 20 CPU cores is the deployment of VMs you can make for data center region. You can break it by raising a support ticket up to 1000 VMs. But again, there are some limitations for everything you get. So whereas if you use different subscriptions for each component, you can break those barriers. You can go with the solution which is very complex, which has many components in it. That's what this concept is. You see, in whatever the architectures you gave, everywhere there are like examples of multiple subscriptions integrated with services connected each other in one of those. So that's what this is about. It's not a feature of high availability. It's a feature of design framework that you can think about. It's like multi-architecture solution.
That's correct, Nishant. So Mohammed here. So somewhat what you
Yeah,
said applies, but what Microsoft talks about is it talks about applying policies, security, IAM, and all that will be much
hmm.
easier when you go for landing zone. This is something new concept and new architecture that they are
Yes,
promoting.
I'm just going
So
through for the first time actually.
yeah, so it it more implies towards the management groups, and definitely yes, management groups and subscriptions and all, like how you can
And the policies.
integrate your workloads, and when you deploy workloads, when you deploy your security, when you deploy your Azure policies and all, so it will make it easy. So you don't have to. And also this one, they are trying to promote this because of the new concept again of passwordless authentication toward that as well. There is so that is what is happening.
Hmm, 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 hmm. That's what. So as mentioned, it's not a particularly concept of any availability. So that's the point I was mentioning. It's a kind of
Yeah,
framework that
correct.
we
Yeah,
design.
yeah.
The
That's
framework
more.
we design for understanding or making a business case or let's say an enterprise lifecycle more easier. Where once I put all my efforts, then the next time I don't need to really put all my hard work on redesigning the architectures. It's a framework, complete framework.
Yeah, that's correct. But the challenge in this is you may land up with a lot of VNet peering costs. The most important
The
thing.
main challenge in this, which I saw now in this given picture which you shared me, I mean, the link which you shared me, it included plenty of components in here, which means like even though it's a simple solution, we are coming up with various features combined in a simple solution because we are looking forward to manage everything from one place. Apart from that, as you mentioned, yes, if there are different services and different subscriptions, then you want to connect them. So you need to do a peering if possible, wherever needed. A gateway is required, the network routing is needed. So a very proper knowledge on network routing is important for sure.
Yeah, the costs, this possibility of higher costs on the side.
Definitely.
That right,
Because
we
the
need to
architecture is like that.
because yeah, that's my challenge. That's what I keep talking to Microsoft. So you are trying to get money from,
Mhm.
so you're finding all the options and ideas. How can we are trying to save costs and you are trying to get that saving cost in
No,
your.
I'll give you an option for that. Though you try something called Azure Blueprint.
Yeah, I know.
If you heard about that Blueprint.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I think if I wanted to do something, I design everything like whatever the complex architecture I have in here, I do it on Blueprint rather than relying on this one because I can see there are many complex things in the line. Somewhere the other way they charge me much. So if I go for Blueprint, where rather than designing such multi-subscription architecture, I plan everything in single place, trying to reduce as much as possible in terms of networking and all these.
Microsoft comes with all their what do you say armory, and to get the customer in utilizing all these features. right? But then the challenge for the customer is how can you save cost, right?
Money.
In
Correct.
Azure, even a bit moves, there is a cost involved there, right?
You should understand how you can save the money. I mean, like where the costing is going and all these. You should understand first if you want to save money. If not, definitely there is a very high challenge of saving money.
Yeah, if my plan works and if if I can design, I'll put everything in a single subscription. So you don't need to save a lot of. You don't
You
need
can
to.
do that. You
Yeah.
can do that. Maybe I don't want to discuss that right now. We'll take this
Yeah.
maybe a
Sure.
different. Yep, you can do because I've been like as I said,
But
I don't.
you did clarify a lot of additional things, particularly in the availability area. Appreciate that.
Welcome, welcome. It's out of box, but yeah, just out of curiosity, since it came into the line, I wanted to speak about that. We'll discuss maybe in the later part since I don't want others to feel it complex about Azure. So let's stick on with what we have. Well, continuing now, and I hope that no more questions for the last discussion, which we had as which was about the availability zones and etc. Now, next one is like core Azure workload products, which I'm going to speak about as mentioned, the virtual machines, app services, container instances, Kubernetes, or what is a virtual desktop, virtual network, gateways, peering, or express route. We'll just understand them as not that everything will be discussed in depth, but you are going to get introduced to them. What these are, why do you use them? Now, Azure Compute Services, anything that comes with CPU core and RAM, which could be managed or seen, something related to that, you can say compute, which will have memory attached to it, disk attached to it, networking, OS sometimes, and all these. So we'll now see what is virtual machines, app services, container instances, Kubernetes, and virtual desktop. One is virtual machine. As I said, on top of a physical machine, you logically deploy a logical server, and that logical server is going to be called virtual machine, where from the physical host, which I said, it will pool the RAM, the CPU core, and possibly the storage from different location. It will use the networking which you provide, and it works as a server, whereas an end user, you can make an RDP or SSH or whatever the mechanism of connections you want to make to the server, host your applications and manage, and that's a virtual machine. So in a single word, a VM is nothing but a logical server that gets created on top of a physical server by pooling the resources from the physical server. So again, for everything which I explain in here, there is a walkthrough of demo. I'll not do the demo right now. I'll complete the theory part, then I'll walk you through the demo practically on how do you create VM, deploy that connection to the VM, make a web server installation, and all these. Apart from VM, the next one, that's an Azure app service, or you can call this one as web app service. So when you say Azure App Service, what is it? The platform as a service, I said, this is the one. So this one, what Microsoft comes up with, they give you a completely deployed infrastructure, which is scalable on demand, which works for .NET or .NET Core or Node.js, Python or PHP. And you can even use it in here with the Ruby application as well, if you, in case you have, where this could give you the enterprise level security, which could meet all the enterprise practices you have. At the same time, your application could easily work on it, where you focus on developing the application and host it rather than managing the server, which is your Azure App Service. So web apps, Azure Web Apps is an example. I'll walk you through this demo as well, where we'll create a web app. We'll see how you host an application from a Docker if in case you take one. How do you host it and see it? I'll walk you through. And the other one is container services in Azure. So what is a container for people who don't know it? It's a very lightweight component which is encapsulated with the application that a developer develops along with the base image of containers orchestration or containers architecture. So this is something in a simplified word. It's not a complete OS, but it's all the packages that are needed for, let's say, a Python application to run. Only those packages are taken and packed together as an image. That's a container. PHP image, it's a container. Or a .NET application, if it wants to work, required packages for a .NET application to work. Those alone are taken and to pack together, and that's a container. It's a very lightweight one which starts very quickly and stops very quickly, so that you can use the available RAM and CPU core for other resources in a wise way. And moreover, you can host 10 different container applications on single server and control all 10 different applications on the amount of RAM and CPU core they consume, and you can scale those applications to the amount of RAM and CPU core that you need within the server on top of the OS level. So for that, in Azure, you have ACI or Azure Container Instances, a service which is platform as a service. I mean that Azure is saying, I'll take care of a physical server deployment for you. I will do that for you. And then on top of the physical server, I'll enable the hypervisor and I'll install Docker for you. And I'll give you the RAM and CPU code that is required for any container to run. So you can only focus on developing a container and running it rather than maintaining the container infrastructure. That's called ACI or Azure Container Instances. So to make it more simple, it's an option where Azure gives you a readily available container hosting environment. Second one, AKS or Azure Kubernetes Service. AKS or Azure Kubernetes Service, if you speak about, this is nothing but it's an option where you can host containers on virtual machines that are managed by a service called Kubernetes. It's an orchestration service from Google where it will let you to host your containers in not one but many servers at the same time, scale them on demand. So any business solutions like a microservices you want to develop using containers, or any container based solutions that you want to build where there is a requirement of an orchestrator, a person, or a tool that could control the container scaling and performance, you can use Kubernetes. For any production workloads which are in form of containers, you can preferably use Kubernetes over container instance because of its orchestration. So container instance is only for testing and developing a container, whereas Kubernetes, you can use it for production environment to host your container applications. Again, deploying a container instance, you have a demo. I'll walk you through this. In Azure portal, I'll show you how do you go and deal with a particular container, like how do you create a container instance, and then how the container instance will work for you, we'll walk you through. Next, which is called Windows Virtual Desktop. What is this? So if you want to know what is Windows Virtual Desktop, scenarios where you have your servers or OS in on-prem, and you prefer that you can bring your on-prem environment to Azure, let's say your on-prem images to Azure platform, and I want to deploy them as servers with some pool of servers where multiple teams or multiple people want to make RDP to the same server to use that CPU core and RAM in a wise way, or deploy applications in the server, whereas my internal applications or any applications that can be accessed from the server by logging in. Let's say an ERP application you develop, which is for internal teams in your office, where people can use that application only if they make RDP access to it or any SSH access to it. Then you can use this Windows Virtual Desktop option where you can create host pools and groups, deploy multiple servers or single server, and have multiple session of users using the same server at the same time, which could save you money and give the benefit of cloud scaling. So that's called Windows Virtual Desktop, which is an option where you can bring your own images from your office and deploy them as servers in cloud. The scenarios where you want to deploy servers in Azure with multiple remote desktops or SSH connections at once, you can think about this Windows Virtual Desktops. Excuse me. Next one, the Azure networking services. Number one, Azure Virtual Network. What is this? A virtual network is a private network in Azure, which is very important for any server to deploy, which means in a simple word, within an Azure data center, logically all your data that you transfer between the servers, they should be maintained secure, which should not be sent to some other customer's server. It should be maintained in a secure way. So that logical security, moreover, letting people from internet to access the data in a secure way or directly from internet or from on-prem. All these logical methodology of communication will take place within a single or within internal data center or between data centers. You can do it using a virtual network. It's like your private network in your own premises. Second one, VPN gateway or virtual private network gateway. It's again an option. So a VPN device like a Cisco or Juniper devices that you have in your office for VPN setup. It's same thing in Azure, where Azure will manage the VPN devices and they could help you to create a VPN tunnel between two VPN devices or two data centers so that you can send or receive between two different data centers, which is a possible example. It could be even a scenario where you want to send and receive data between two different environments like an on-prem to Azure. So a virtual private network or a VPN In a simplified word, it's an example of a VPN device that is managed and given to you on Azure, where you can use it to connect between Azure to Azure environments or on-prem to Azure. Whereas Express Route Circuit, if you heard about a word called direct connection, it's nothing but from Azure data center to your office in on-prem, you make a direct optical fiber connection rather than using a VPN device which is from public internet. So it will be an optical fiber connection from your office to Azure. So you can use a dedicated line, send your data in a secure way with complete encryption, which could give you a bandwidth between 100 MB per second to 100 GB per second. So that's a very good thing, which is an express route circuit. Scenarios where you want to connect your on-prem data center to Azure and you don't want to use public internet for data sharing, let's say mass migration and daily sync and all these, you can use express route circuits. So Sai Kiran is saying that he's not able to hear me, but my audio is clear. So check your connection. Okay. Now, followed by this, the next one is again creating a virtual network. I'll walk you through that later. So how do you create a virtual network? And then if you want to create virtual machines on top of the network and test their connection, how does it look like? We'll discuss that. Next to that, you have Azure Storage Service. So apart from your virtual network, which I discussed now, which is giving you network level benefits, we do have a choice. And that could be like, let's say, storage services. What is this one? Let's say you want to speak about storing data like pictures, audios, and videos. You have that. One is called container storage, or you can call that particular term as blob storage, binary large object, which means blob storage, it is an option where you can use it to store any unstructured data like a text document, videos, audios, which you want to do streaming. Like I want to use Netflix or Amazon Prime where I do audio or video streaming. Such data you can easily store and manage and do it in the container storage, which is called blob storage in Azure. Same way, if you want to have a storage like a disk, let's say disk storage, what is it? For any virtual machine which needs a storage space in which it can maintain its data like application data, database and all. That is for a VM, a persistent storage space. That's called disk storage here. You can even use this one for Dockers and containers where they can use a container application can use the disk storage as a persistent storage to maintain all the data in it. You have Azure Files on the other part. If you heard about your file share in your organization, it's the same thing. Any scenario where you want to use a file share, where a file share could help you to share your documents, data between you and your team, where you people want to cross collaborate and work with it, you can use Azure File Share, which works on the server message block protocol. So making it simple, you don't need a file server to be managed in cloud. You can deploy a service called storage account and you can use file share to share data between people by attaching or mounting that file share to the servers. Now in the storage, there is a very good benefit. That is, I can store my data in a storage account in a hot tier, in a cool tier, or in an archival tier. So it's a simple way. Scenarios where you need to do data storage to be cheaper, or if possible, maintain the data in different tiers in different times, you can use this. There is a container thing which is used for storing binary large objects like video, audio, or text. There you can do this. I'll take an example like a hospital. The data of patients who are admitted in the hospital, we access it very frequently, like every few hours once. So such data you need to access so frequently. So we can keep that data in a hot tier like any medical bills or any data related to that patient. We can keep it in hot tier, which could be costlier, but it will let you to read the data faster. Whereas cool tier you have, in the event of using a cool tier, any data that you don't access so frequently, and you need to maintain it because within next 30 days or some period of time I might access it. Let's say the data of those patients who got treated and got discharged, they might come back within a week or a month for secondary checkup. You don't access that frequently, but you do access the data somewhere sometime, so you can keep it in cool tier, which could help you to save some money. So infrequently access data or data that you store for at least 30 days of time without accessing, you can use it cool tier in that case. So archival on the other part, the data of that patient who come to hospital after the discharge for secondary checkup is done. He's not going to come back to the hospital anymore. But let's say for medical records or after a few years, if you want to check their records, we need that. So archival we can go for, which means it will hibernate your data and store it in magnetic tapes. So when you want to retrieve it, you need to move the data back to cool or the hot tier to see it. But the benefit you're getting now, that's where the main thing comes. That is, you save a lot of money since you're not storing your data in any costlier storage. It's a magnetic tape, which is very cheaper. So data which has to be hibernated or maintained for more than 6 months. Preferably, you can use archival tier. Making it simple, your blob storage, which I discussed in containers, that could help you to move your data between hot, cool, and archival as an option. Excuse me. I'll walk you through this demo as well on how do you create a storage account, then how do you work with the blob storage, and how do you access the data. I'll show you. Next, the last one, the database services in Azure. So apart from your apart from your binary data or apart from your virtual network or VMs, the database services, if you see, you have Cosmos database in Azure, a service which you can use for the purpose of storing any NoSQL databases like a MongoDB, Core SQL database, or a Graph database, or a Cassandra DB. You can store all such kind of NoSQL database in Azure Cosmos DB. It's a serverless database service which can scale out on demand for you, which can replicate your data globally. So one country to another country, it can replicate for you in an elastic way. Moreover, the very good benefit if you speak about this Cosmos DB is you can maintain multiple read and write replicas in different data centers at the same time, which is a benefit. Whereas you can see a relational database, if you speak about, you have Azure SQL Server database, which is database as a service. Azure is developing the DB and giving it to you. You can just use the DB. It's always based on the latest stable version of SQL Server engine, whichever you have in on-prem. So for relational DB, people who wanted to use SQL Server, you can use this Azure SQL DB. Same way, you have Azure database for MySQL. People who are interested in using MySQL databases in Azure, you can use this Azure SQL database for MySQL, which is a managed service in Azure, which means Azure manages the server and everything, and you can deploy MySQL DB. And then Azure database for PostgreSQL we have. In the event of this one, it's again a PostgreSQL database, which is same like open source Postgre database engine, but a server that is managed by Azure, where you can just use it as a PostgreDB service. So for relational and NoSQL options, you have these things. Now for people who are interested in migrating a DB, let's say a relational database from on-premises to Azure, you can think about a service called Azure SQL Managed Instance. What is this one? Azure SQL Managed Instance is a service which is specially designed for DB migration. So for customers who want to lift and shift their database in on-premises to Azure by having minimal downtime, or let's say zero downtime, you can use this Azure Migrate instance. It's nothing but a virtual machine completely managed by Azure, which has the virtual network support and the benefits of automatic patching, version management, backups, and everything, where in a simplest way, this could help you to lift your DB in on-prem and shift that to Azure completely and deploy it, which is a benefit. So there are major other benefits of getting discounts and management of license in a hybrid environment, where a SQL managed instance is something that you can think about. So in a simplified fashion, a managed instance is something that Azure is giving you as a service. Apart from that, I'll have a walkthrough for you. That is, how do you create a SQL Server DB and querying with that in a quicker fashion? I'll walk you through. So apart from that, we have Marketplace in Azure, which is nothing but something I showed you. So Azure Marketplace is a place where anyone can go and purchase any resources of Azure, which means it could be container solutions, virtual machines, Visual Studio databases, or it could be developer tools, anything. So these are like partners with Microsoft. Even you can become a partner to Azure if you have a qualitative product in the market which is having a good revenue. You can sell your product in the marketplace, and that's something which will be used by other customers, where Azure will give a hosting environment like CPU, core, and RAM as a virtual machine in which your software will be working. So that's your marketplace. So in an overall review, we went through the data center regions, the management tools, the compute, networking, storage, and DB services, and understood about Azure Marketplace as of now. So I'll be now taking